Trust is the foundation to any type of relationship. If the community can't trust law enforcement and law enforcement can't trust community, we're never going to get anywhere.
There is a connection between constitutional policing, public safety, and police and community trust.
If we're going to really have significant reductions in violent crime, we must increase trust of the community within the police department.
And when you look at community, especially communities of Black and brown color, the relationship with police departments have been destroyed. The trust has to be built.
I think the state of distrust with community members and police officers is a historical reality. The history of policing, at least in our interaction with them, go all the way back to antebellum slavery.
Reconstruction of the black codes, Jim Crow and separate but equal.
Everyone has seen the grainy footage of how brutal our police department was. I call it policing under the shadow, that even today, what we're doing is colored by our position and our history.
At every era of this country's history, the narration of Black folk and dark-skinned bodies has always been one around violence, right? And the response has always been one around force from the state.
Not only were we on the wrong side of history in the 1960s, but we've been on the wrong side of history in modern history.
The war on crime, the war on drugs, the war on poverty, they all sort of inherently became this racialized process where disproportionate numbers of young black men were being arrested, brutalized, sent to jail.
That's the moment when the nation began its march toward what we now recognize as mass incarceration.
The harm we caused in our communities and in our families, we caused harm that I don't think we can fully describe or fully understand. And so when we think about violence in our communities, when people don't see us as a legitimate organization that's going to be trustworthy and fair, they will then begin to take things into their own hands rather than trusting the criminal justice system.
If communities don't feel like when the worst stuff is happening, the state can be trusted to help them, then they handle things themselves. And that creates violence. That is legal cynicism in action.
And so we feel like in order for law enforcement to be seen as legitimate, it's going to have to gain the trust. And in order to do that, it's going to have to change the way that it does its job. And it cannot do that without that process being informed by those who've been closest to the pain over the decades of our story.
The National Network is this ongoing R&D project. It is the creation of people on the ground, on the front lines, who want to do things differently.
Our focus is on the people who are at the highest risk in the most vulnerable communities in the country. And the way the National Network has always worked is to find people who are willing to take on hard questions and willing to break new ground and to work with them to try to figure out how to do better.
The entrepreneurial spirit has extended from the original work on group violence to drug markets to intimate partner violence to violence within prisons.
Overwhelmingly, the community wants to be safe. The thing that we hold most dear is working with communities to help them create the communities that they want.
We have a responsibility to make sure that we have solutions that depend on immediate, measured, targeted responses to the highest risk drivers of violence or those who may be victimized by violence.
One of the most important sort of shifts that we have to do when thinking about gun violence is prioritize victimization.
Offenders are often people that were victims before, and usually the victimization process started very early on. Extreme exposure to trauma.
We have to, in fact, think about this in a way that prioritizes saving people's lives, as opposed to simply looking for criminal justice or punitive solutions.
What we all want is the greatest level of safety for the least amount of enforcement. Because enforcement ultimately is like chemotherapy. Like you'll do it if you have to, but it creates a lot of harm.
It's a recognition that we shouldn't be just bombing into a neighborhood and blanket enforcement on everyone. We should be focused on that small percentage that the community want us to focus on and will actually help us focus on. if we go about it the right way.
So if you can make, say, better, fewer contacts, you can not only do more good, you can actually do less harm. And both of those things, I think, are fundamentally meaningful.
When we work together in our separate lanes, that working together can help drive down violence in our community, and that's where I think there's a lot of value in community-police relationships.
We're seeing the results, and this is the way we do business now.
Well, I think one of the things we don't take into consideration is the things this population has been exposed to. When you live in a community that has a high violence, a high homicide rate, a high shooting rate, we never address the trauma.
I think trauma-informed care helps us figure out how to work with this population. I think so many times in social services, no matter how well intended, it was about checking a box. You know, you're measured on how many services you sign this person up for. That doesn't necessarily work that well with somebody who's been shot or is living in fear of being shot.
So if our goal is to work with this person to keep them from getting shot, then everything we do should intentionally be about that goal. So I think the big shift there has been saying affirmative outreach. We can't wait for people to come to us. We've got to meet people where they are. We've got to find a bunch of ways, big and small, to build trust relationships.
You know, a lot of these guys, man, they've kind of been raising themselves, and having someone who can bring something simple as groceries and then also take the time to sit down and have a conversation. It builds trust. It lets them know that we care.
If all we do is just say we're just going to reform the police, that will never work. None of that can occur unless there are policy decisions that are made at much higher levels.
There are a bunch of prosecutors who have been grappling with what their role should be, what they can do to produce public safety, to heighten legitimacy, to do less harm.
The reality is that the majority of the people that we prosecute are members of our community that will come back to our community. So we want to make sure that whatever we do, we don't increase the harm to that person.
So we have people who are out there on these frontiers, asking and experimenting with different approaches to the role of the prosecutor. And we want to learn from them, we want to encourage them to do more, but we also want to bring them together so they can create sort of common narrative.
I don't know how we can repair the harm and get to a better place unless we start working together and creating an environment where people believe that what we're doing is the right thing.
I'd like to take a moment to address a significant and fundamental issue confronting our profession. The history of the law enforcement profession is replete with examples of bravery, self-sacrifice, and service to the community. It is also clear that the history of policing has had darker periods. There have been times when law enforcement officers, because of the laws enacted by federal, state, and local governments, have been the face of oppression to far too many of our fellow citizens.
What we think of as the usual reform agenda is not going to cut it. We have not faced what got us here, and dealing with that is what reconciliation and truth-telling are about.
For our part, the first step in this process is for the law enforcement profession and the IACP to acknowledge and apologize for the actions of the past and the role that our profession has played in society's historical mistreatment of communities of color.
So the trust building work that's underway is, I think, the most important work that the criminal justice reform movement is engaged in right now.
As a part of this criminal justice system, we've done things that have caused harm. Our police department was not part of the solution. We were part of the problem.
Amen.
I think it was important because you can't go into a relationship with unresolved issues and grievances. I think it's important to clear the air, to acknowledge where you are, and then work from there.
It opened up that door by admitting first the faults. When they heard these conversations, we were all kind of looking at each other like, wow. It's like you've been waiting for somebody to say something like this.
We are in the position of power and have been for decades and decades. We, as police officers, police leaders, police chiefs, need to step out and make those acknowledgments first. Then we can begin to talk about the issues after actually listening, active listening from our communities, and then we can start to have that meaningful dialogue.
Well, for us, the idea behind the small circles is face-to-face, uninterrupted, unhindered, truthful conversation.
Why not take the chance to say, I'm not here to lock you up. I'm not here to harm you. In fact, I'm here to protect you.
We're hearing them and they're hearing us, and we want to take it back to the community so that we can learn more about each other, learn how to work together to make our neighborhoods safer.
I think that creates a lot of healing, and that's really powerful, and it makes people want to trust again. That's where we can get real growth.
We can't do it alone. And what I mean by that is that social services cannot do it alone. Community members cannot fight that battle alone. And nor do I think police can. I think that we gotta work together.
In its simplest form, it's about community. Police are a part of the community, not apart from the community. As one community, we work together to help our community.
Now to wear this uniform and to wear this badge and to understand this history, we have no choice. We have no choice but to do the right thing, to serve our citizens with dignity and honor, and make sure this police department is one that they can be proud of.